You see Canadians choosing not to travel to the US right now because of the trade war. That's a decision that's easier for a lot of folks to make. Not necessarily so easy for people who make a living as touring artists. Today on the show, the complicated decision not to tour the US right now. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Listen, why don't we settle into the conversation by starting here? Her most recent album, Humanhood, that is Toronto singer Tamara Lindeman, better known as The Weather Station. This weekend, The Weather Station kicks off her tour in Boston, and that tour is going to take her all over the U.S. for the better part of April and May. Normally, this would be business as usual for Tamara and her band, but look around. These are not normal times. Canada is in the middle of a trade war with the United States, and you see the headlines that are honestly kind of hard to believe. You know, more and more stories of Canadian travelers being detained at airports and at border crossings. But for Canadian musicians who rely on touring for their livelihoods, the choice to stay home is not so easy. Tamara Lindeman is here to talk about why. Tamara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Listen, you're about to play a show in Boston. You're about to kick off a tour. That tour is going to take you all over the U.S. It's not the first time you've done this. You've done this a bunch of times before. How do you describe your feelings just getting ready for a tour this time to sort of, go tour America versus all the other tours that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, it feels heavy. It feels heavy to go there right now. I do feel like a heavy heart about it, to be perfectly honest. But, I am going. So it's definitely less light and joyful than it was to go to Europe and the UK last month.
Tell me about the heaviness. What does that feel like for you?
I just feel, the tension and everything that's happening there. I think it's just so devastating and sad. And I feel weird as a Canadian going down to the US right now, for sure.
I think to just give people sort of maybe a timeline to get them maybe oriented around this. The fact that you're starting this tour now does not mean that you planned this tour now. Tours take a little while to figure out, the route that you're going to take, the venues you're going to play. Do you want to just maybe talk a little bit about the setup for what it takes to pull off a tour because there's so much planning that goes in advance of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we were booking this tour 8 months ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, tours are booked almost a year in advance sometimes. I mean, this tour is, all independent promoters, small venues. This is not with Live Nation. Everyone that's worked on this tour and that I've worked with for years is thought of canceling, independent people with small companies. So, yeah, the thought of canceling a tour like this is, there's a lot of things in my mind, but, from a pragmatic perspective, it wouldn't be simple, and the people that I would hurt would be all these lovely people who I've worked with for years, and primarily my band, for sure. Yeah.
Do you want to walk me through like just some of the hoops that maybe people don't know about that you got to walk through just to book a tour in the U.S. on a good day, like on in normal circumstances, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I have a booking agent, and they do the booking, but yeah, it's extremely complicated. I mean, you got to get holds on venues months in advance, and you got to work out the money, and you got to work out it's very complex, and yeah, tours are booking further and further in advance, and when you commit to a date, you're basically bumping off everyone else who might have wanted that date. So you really have to stick to it because as I say, these are all smaller venues that are independent, and when a show doesn't happen, it's really hard for the folks there.
I also got to imagine, like, if you're trying to take your whole band with you, you got to start the process of arranging visas months in advance. That's very expensive. It's not just kind of, you can't just say, what, leave that money on the table. I'm just not going to use it. But go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, I always say to everyone, I mean, one of the things that's so painful about going to the US is that visas are incredibly expensive. And everywhere else we go, I mean, when we go to the UK, we get a visa, but it's about $100.
Mm.
And when we go to the EU, there's no visa at all. We just waltz in, say we're a band playing, and they're like, welcome. So it's
Wow.
just the US that requires these expensive visas, and I wish they didn't.
Hmm.
But yeah, in this case, yeah, we had to get a visa. And in the case of my band, I mean, it's everybody's freelance. So if the tour doesn't happen, it's bad for everybody.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's the situation.
Well, Tamara, I gotta say, I feel bad for you in the sense that like you are planning and starting this tour in a difficult moment, right? In a difficult moment where you have this moment of, I guess, like there's the intense kind of national pride here in Canada in terms of focusing on the stuff that we do because of the threats of terrorism, the threats of annexation, and you're getting some expressions of patriotism that sound like, you know, what we should be doing is buying Canadian and investing in our energy right here in this country. And with that, I think like you've heard some leaders say, you know what, don't travel to the United States right now, which I think raises some questions for artists who are Canadian who are trying to figure out how to tour the United States. Louise Penny, the author, said that she's not going to go on a book tour in the United States. It's a little bit different, I imagine, for musical artists. How's all this sitting with you? What's your response to people who say, you know what, this is the time to stay home for the good of the country?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I
Mm.
actually really subscribe to a lot of this of like, reinvesting here, taking a look at what's important to us. And,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree with that. And I think anyone who chooses not to go to the US, I respect that choice, and it makes total sense to me. But for me, thinking about this show, you know, I feel that my job right now is to communicate. When I
Mm.
write songs, when I make social media posts, when I write my newsletter, increasingly I've felt the most purpose right now in trying to speak to what's happening and getting ideas out there into the world. And so when I think of my tour in the US that begins on Friday, I'm thinking about being in a room physically with people in America, holding a microphone, and how I want to use that moment, what I want to say, what I want to
Mm.
share. And so I think that if I was pursuing a career in the US that, asked me to change my principles or my politics, that would be out of my integrity. But in
Yeah.
this case, my show is actually quite relevant to the moment, and my songs feel relevant. When I was singing them in Europe, I was saying nothing needs you so badly as a lie. I was talking about my song The Robber. I was like, this feels very relevant. So
Mm.
I do feel that going to the US and playing shows in this context that are relevant to the context is different. And for me, an opportunity to speak to what's happening. And for me, also, it's galvanizing in terms of thinking of that moment on stage when I have the mic and what I want to say.
So, right, so the lights go up and you come on stage and it's time to sort of greet the audience. Is this something that becomes a part of the live show for you? Like, do you have to sort of explicitly say it, or do you feel like the music will do all the speaking for you? Like, do you think these conversations will be a part of how you address the crowd in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm gonna feel it out. But yeah, I think realistically, I'll probably begin with the music,
Hmm.
and then I usually get to the politics towards the end of the night. Because I've really observed that when I walk out onto stage, we're all a little shy, we're not ready yet. The show moves like explicitly from disconnection to connection. So
Hmm.
I've been in Europe when I was getting into politics. I was usually doing it at the end of the night when I felt like I'd develop trust
Hmm.
with the people who are there. So yeah, I think that's probably what will happen, and I'll see how things unfold. I'm also looking forward to talking to Americans and being there and listening to people and finding out how they're feeling
Hmm.
and trying to make those connections.
Do you find you have to sell people on the parts of the show and the songs that are more outwardly political than others? Like, do you feel like you have to sort of say, you know what, we got to settle into this, but it has this larger political meaning? I'm only bringing this up because, like, I think of Jason Isbell, and he's got this song
Mm,
called "White Man's World," and he's sort of like dealing with explicitly being a white man in Nashville and what all of that has meant for his career, the good and the bad. And quite often he said when he plays it, he sees people leave they go like, I'll take my washroom break now, and they'll come back later. And as punishment for those people leaving, he'll play his biggest song, which is Cover Me Up, immediately after that to be like, you know what, you don't get the big song, buddy. You're not going to be in the room for that. Do you find people are showing up saying, you know what, I want to engage in the political conversation that you, Tamara, want to have?
I mean, I feel lucky, and it's an interesting thing I've realized ever since I have become vocal about all of this, is that it does mean that the people that come to the shows are a very self-selecting group. And it's a very safe space. You know,
Yeah.
I feel I love the people that come. I mean, they're amazing. So I feel lucky in that I'm not trying to exist in some other world, and it's a pretty safe space.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always feel that I don't want to, talk down to anyone, and I'm being thoughtful in this moment in myself of like I don't want to be, I recognize that I'm not in the US and I'm not going through this myself personally, so I need to be thoughtful of how I approach it.
Yeah.
But I do feel like uh, people that come luckily know what they're getting into, and they want to talk about things. So I'm grateful for that.
I mean, I think like also, I think as a part of the spirit of generosity, like I saw that on your Instagram, you posted, "Hey, for the people who come to the show," like basically saying, "I know that you are not your government,"
Hmm.
which is to say, I'm here to have a conversation with you and for us to share this musical space and communal space together. It's not about you being a representative of, what your government stands for. Why do you think it was important for you to say, "Look, before I even get to the U.S., I just got to just put this out there. I know that you don't necessarily, feel the same way your government does."
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's easy to get caught up in the headlines,
Hmm.
and obviously there's a couple 100 million Americans that did not vote for this guy and are in varying states of shock and loss, and
Hmm.
they're trying to figure out what to do. And obviously I feel like it goes without saying, but I did still want to say it because I often find Americans are keep apologizing to me.
Hmm.
That's what tends to happen.
Hmm.
And I've been thinking a lot about that of like it's not, when you didn't choose something, it's not your fault.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean it's not, your responsibility to do what you can.
Yeah, you're still, engaged in a part of that
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
I also got to say that like the annexation talks very quickly sort of veered from, okay, this feels like blustering and sort of grand posturing to you saw the political theorists start to say, we think this might be partly about fresh water. We think this partly might be about resources, and to try to speculate like what political reasons might be introducing this kind of idea to someone like Donald Trump. Your work is pretty engaged with climate change. You've been pretty outspoken about climate change. How do you think that figures into the conversation that you end up wanting to have, both in your music and on stage during this tour?
Yeah, I
Small
mean,
question, right?
yeah, no,
Yeah.
just a small question. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, I am looking to history,
Hmm.
I'm looking at the things that are being said, and I think we have to take them very seriously. And what scares me, and I think is the biggest, most important thing about what's happening, is that this administration is attacking. It's the most climate informed administration, except it's doing the opposite of what the right thing to do is. I mean, they're gutting the EPA, the NOAA. They're basically they're defunding all climate action.
Hmm.
They're investing into drilling more. I mean, it's like literally they're putting not just Americans, but like the world at risk. And I cannot fathom what they could possibly want from this. It seems like it is a fascist response to the climate crisis. And I I don't know why, I don't understand it. I'm trying to.
Hmm.
But I think if you look at everything they're doing through a climate lens, all the annexation of Canada suddenly makes sense because
Hmm.
we do have a lot of fresh water, we do have a lot of critical minerals, and that's why it's really scary. And I think we should be taking it seriously. The worst case scenario, we took it too seriously. That's not a bad situation to be in. But once again, all of this has nothing to do with American people. I mean, I
Hmm.
don't think that Trump he barely even speaks for his base. I don't know who he speaks for. This is not what the American people want. But I truly hope that people are paying attention to what's going on the climate front, because I do believe, and I've said this online, I think if you go back and read like UN reports about climate from years ago, they're saying, one of the worst things that could happen out of this is conflict and war. And, this is a response that people have to threat. And I just truly hope that they can be stopped before they do more damage.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to begin. And yeah, it's it's pretty tough, but yeah, it scares me quite deeply as a Canadian. And I also think that we need to remember that, authoritarian regimes happen all over the world. This is
Hmm.
something that happens. It happened in Hungary, it happened in the Philippines, it happened in Germany. I mean, it's not new. And we need to take seriously the fact that it could get that bad. And I do believe that Americans are tough and rebellious and multiple and are not going to let it go that far. But, that is the direction it's heading. And, we are right next door. And so we need to remain Canada, and
Hmm.
we need to remain a safe country. Hopefully this isn't too much for you for this
No,
moment.
listen, the
Yeah.
notion that we need to be reminded that we need to remain Canada, like
Yeah.
I often find myself kind of like needing a moment to step back to realize like those are the stakes of what we are talking about. Like
Yeah.
this is not has not always been the case, and now we are really in that moment. And I think like I'm always confronted by reality, like the stakes of the reality of this moment, because I don't always let myself fully plunge into it.
Hmm.
Just to sort of take it back full circle and to the idea of you being an artist and feeling like your job is to communicate. I think communication itself is kind of challenging. Like you raise the point of not everyone. Donald Trump doesn't speak for everybody. I have to go back and go like they did vote for him. And maybe his platform wasn't that he was going to annex Canada, but he was kind of explicit about being a tariffs guy, and that ended up being something that materializes. And I always have to like cohere reality with what I thought reality was, and you mentioned climate change and the ways that we're talking about climate change, and the New York Times ran this piece maybe 3 weeks ago. They sort of laid out all the words that the Trump administration said, the government documents are to avoid, and climate change was in fact one of them. Like if you work for the government, maybe you shouldn't use the words climate change. That's pretty striking. And so just to take it back to your role as an artist with a platform, how do you think the last few months have maybe transformed how you think about what that role is?
It just galvanizes me to do my best. And,
Hmm.
I'm just one person. I don't have like a team of people helping me with this, but I do feel that, especially as a Canadian, where I'm looking at the situation, I'm like, I have a level of safety that maybe some of my American friends don't have,
Hmm.
to do more, to say more. And I feel that anyone with the courage and the platform should be doing what they can, because it's literally like everything is at stake. And I think a lot about what's happening in the US is all about the story. It's all about knowledge. It's all about truth.
Hmm.
They are gutting all scientific research, specifically around climate in particular, to hide from Americans what's happening.
Hmm.
And I can't wrap my head around the why of it. Um, but I think it is the most consequential. It could be the most consequential thing in human history.
Hmm.
So, I don't back down from saying that, and I hope I can continue to say it more. And I feel lucky that I'm not there, you
Hmm.
know, um, and that I do have a voice. And I think it just once again comes back to like in this country, we need to be so, so careful of not letting any of this, become our reality,
Hmm.
where we can't speak freely. And yeah, I mean, it's once again, I just return to, this is something that happens through history. It's something, you know, it's something that's happened to millions and millions of people. So it's not new, um, but we need to stand up to it, I guess.
Mhm. Tamara,
Mhm.
I appreciate that sometimes clarity is unavailable to all of us, but absent that, the best that we can hope for in those moments is courage. And so I appreciate you for the courage that you do have, and for using your show in the way that you're using it. So thank you for having the courage, and also thank you for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes, of
Yeah,
course.
thanks.
Tamara Lindeman is a Canadian musician who goes by the name The Weather Station. She was speaking about her decision to travel to the United States on tour. She begins this tour this weekend. She's going to be stopping in New York, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and other places.
Wake up, raise the curtains from your deep provincial eyes. Speak up.
I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. You just heard me talk to the Weather Station about what's at stake right now for Canadian artists who are crossing the border at this political moment. I'd like to bring in Dave Bidini of the Rheostatics to talk about the ways that Canadian musicians can maybe survive and thrive while looking right here to this country. Dave, welcome to the show, friend.
Hey, great
This-
to be on your show.
Oh, it's so nice to have you here. Listen, you were just hearing, a bit of Northern Wish from Rheostatics, your song. And I think what you hear in your music is this idea of, celebrating the idea of Canadian culture, but also interrogating the idea of Canadian culture. That you were listening to that conversation just now with Tamara Lindeman. She sounded conflicted, right? She sounded conflicted about the idea of taking her music to the United States. As a musician yourself, when you were listening to that conversation, what part of it resonated with you, do you think?
Well, I think, it's a personal choice, right?
Yeah.
And I would never begrudge a musician, the opportunity to make a living. But I think everybody has their own line, and for me, I mean, I don't have a record that I have to go out and promote and
Hmm.
play to either, so it's a different situation. I'm not going to America as a human. I'm not going there as a tourist.
Hmm.
So I would parse that with whether I would go there as a musician. I mean, we have plans for a record coming out in the fall, and some of it involves the American East Coast stuff. So we'll kind of deal with that when we get there. But I'm hoping that this instance, you referenced it in the beginning there. Maybe it can become a positive for our musical culture in our country.
Hmm.
I think this is the summer of Canadians being on the road in Canada. And how beautiful would it be if there was music waiting for them, at every port of call, at every stop along the way. I think there's opportunity for us to kind of arrow inwards a little bit, all musicians, as opposed to arrowing outwards.
That's a part of what you wrote on Blue Sky. I just want to read it real quick. On Blue Sky, you
Uh-oh.
wrote, I'm going to read it, dude. I'm going to do it. You wrote, ever since we hit the road in 87, we've been writing with the soft strength and sublime greatness of our complicated country. Continue to support the workers, artists, farmers, makers who live where you do. They prosper, we prosper. Let's look north, not south. Let's see what we can find that's new. I'm wondering if you can just unpack that statement a little bit. How can that apply to Canadian music trying to navigate this moment, and Canadian musicians trying to navigate this moment?
I will say, in the beginning, we devoutly worked our careers in Canada just because everybody told us we had to go elsewhere, and it was at a time when there was cultural colonialism everywhere, whether it was American or even British musical influence on the kind of bands that were being formed, the kind of sounds that were coming out of our cities, and then suddenly we ourselves and other bands discovered this kind of essential Canadian perspective in music. And by singing about our country, we wanted to sing about our country to Canadians mostly. And so really, the path that we took was Highway 1 right across the country, and then, of course, in the East Coast. And I'm so lucky looking back that it delivered us to these incredible places within the country that I never would have known was I not a musician. So I think, and I do think that still applies, but we learned kind of the hard way through, treacherous van accidents and a lot of other misadventure. And touring Canada is like adventure travel, I've always said, and dangerous adventure travel as well. But it's a hard country to tour. I mean, Calgary and Regina are still 7 hours apart. No
Well,
matter
that's what I was
how,
going to say. That's, I mean, like
yeah.
the big attraction of touring the United States. Everything that you just said about touring Canada is so beautiful and so romantic. But the big attraction about touring the United States has always been that, you know, you can get to two major markets within like a 3-hour drive, and
Yeah,
that is maybe not so possible in this country. How do you think you make touring Canada just a bit more hospitable?
Well, I know, all of the candidates in the current federal election talk about, supporting industries that are affected by American tariffs and the possibility of
Yeah.
American invasion. So listen, let's look at culture a little bit, folks. Like, why has there never been a travel subsidy for bands committing to tour across Canada? Why has there never been protection of the artists and the musicians who articulate what it's like to be Canadian, as opposed to, the other industries, which also deserve our support? And I do feel that artists are always clipped first, like we're the first to fall off the vine.
Hmm.
And I think, I think there can be built-in incentives for bands to get out there just to support people who literally, figuratively are putting their lives on the line
Hmm.
by touring across Canada. I mean, the summer is a bit better, but the shoulder seasons and winter, man, it's
Yeah.
about survival. Like when we got to Vancouver, it was like we survived. And I think that made us become a band of 45, 50 years because
Yeah.
we're able to do that. And man, I would love that for other bands, of younger generations to be able to have that opportunity, but it's so expensive. So let's see if we can move that into the agenda when it comes to talking about what we're going to do for the future of art in Canada.
Yeah, you hear everybody talk about the art of touring in the fall or the winter, and trying to make that Highway 1 drive,
Yep.
and you go, okay, it gets in some spots it gets a little treacherous, but also it is this kind of bonding experience that you're talking about. When you think about the larger sort of infrastructure of Canada's music economy, where do you think we can make some changes to just make it a bit more self-sustaining, so that the first thing you got to, so you can do other things aside from saying, oh, to survive as an artist, I got to make sure that I tour the U.S.
I mean, I think, I do think, like, again, I think subsidized touring would be an
Yeah.
important part. But also, Canada's so top heavy when it comes to, musicians who actually make a living and make money. I think there can be profit sharing. I mean, I know musicians, I won't name them, but I've seen what happens when they get that SOCAN check. They kind of don't know what to do with it. First of all, they don't need it. Second of all, they got to figure out what to do with this kind of extra income. We should spread that around. Those working musicians. I mean, I think the average yearly income for a musician is like $13,000 in Canada. It's almost below the poverty line. It is below the poverty line. I think there can be some profit sharing when it comes to institutional payouts.
Because the SOCAN
for
checks
musicians.
tend to be sort of a larger chunk of that goes to the incredibly popular artists, is what you mean.
Yeah, that's right. The bands
Yeah.
that are constantly playing on the radio.
Yeah.
So I think there can be, again, I think that the larger, more profitable bands that have had these lives and their careers, and I know like Canadian musicians tend to be really good to each other anyways. So if there was some sort of apparatus in place where some of that money could be funded back into bands just trying to survive, I think would help us.
I also got to say that, like Tamara just mentioned in that chat, that the idea of like touring the U.S., visas for musicians touring the U.S. are just so incredibly expensive. It costs $100 for the U.K. The EU costs absolutely nothing, as she mentioned. And then if you want to go to the U.S., it costs you $1,600 per band member. That is not only is that a massive increase, it's a massive increase that happened under President Biden. And so that's something that is like worth keeping in mind as people think about the cultural sector right now. And just given how quickly things have maybe escalated between Canada and the U.S. these past few months, it's not hard to imagine a future where that number goes even higher. And I think like in this moment, in that worst case scenario, where do you see the hope and opportunity for Canadian musicians, where if that door sort of begins to close in a way?
I mean, I've always felt that there's hope and opportunity at home. I still think there are a lot of people that listen to music that don't go Canada first, that turn towards imported music that's popular elsewhere, mostly pop music. I think it's just like buying locally, right? Just like buying the mustard and the pickled beets and the cheese from the people that make it up the street. Man, support your neighborhood band, support your bar at the end of the street, support your club. When you're on Apple Music or your platforms or whatever, look to see where that band is from. If they're from where you live, chances are they're singing about your life. And it's way better now than it was 40 years ago when we started in 1980. but we still have a long way to go as Canadians, and here's an opportunity to move that forward even more.
Dave Bidini, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your presence. Thanks again so much, man.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Of course, Dave Bidini is a member of Rheostatics and the publisher of the West End Phoenix newspaper in Toronto. That is it for the podcast today. I got to tell you, actually, speaking of supporting Canadian music, I'm heading to the Junos today because in the middle of all this uncertainty, it is a moment to celebrate all of Canadian music. Should tell you if you're in Vancouver, come out to the Junos Songwriter Circle. I'm hosting that. Some great songwriters are going to be performing. Nemesis will be there. Lee Followbeck will be there. Sarah Harmer is going to be there. The Junos, of course, Sunday at 8 p.m. If you'd like to listen to the Junos instead of watch, which I highly recommend that you do, me and my pal Tom Power, we are going to be on the radio on Sunday night, and we are going to be doing Anne Murray impressions. So please listen to that. Otherwise, we'll see you on Monday, which is for the big Junos after show. It's going to be a great time. My name is Elamin. This is Commotion. See you next week.